Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. To preface, I live in a country that employs a large foreign expat workforce in pretty much every industry and at all levels. For someone to move here for work, they have to be sponsored by a company or the individual that's employing them. I own and operate a small restaurant business here and employ more than a handful of foreigners as servers, cleaners, kitchen staff, drivers, etc. So, here's the story. I was lounging on my couch enjoying the last of my weekend one day in early 2023 when I got a call telling me that one of our sponsored employees, a server, let's call her Maria, was picked up for indecent exposure essentially. Long story short, she was caught hooking up with a guy in a private booth at a local restaurant. Basically, the police walked in on them while they were engaged in some seriously heavy petting. They were fully clothed, but the guy she was with, or practically on top of, I should say, had his junk out. Turns out he works at the restaurant 2 doors down from where she worked. After a bit of chastising and threatening to escalate the situation and have them deported to sufficiently scare their senses back into them, they let them go, but not before signing a pledge-type document promising to never repeat the offense, or else a slap on the wrist, basically, and everyone got to go home. But it doesn't end there. That night, something clicked in my brain, and I had the thought, how and why did the police find them in a private booth in the back of a restaurant before the restaurant's own staff did? So I called the restaurant the next day. I thought maybe they called the police on them immediately for some reason. Or maybe the couple got belligerent when staff asked them to stop. Turns out the staff didn't notice a thing. In fact, up until that day, the police had never been to that restaurant before, and when they did, they simply walked in, went straight to the back booths where the two were seated, and busted right in. I realized this meant that someone must have seen them and called the cops on them point blank. The question was who? I decided to speak to Maria. I wanted to speak to her anyway that day, both to check in and get her version of the situation. I also gave her the employer, "You know you did something stupid" chat and reassured her that she's keeping her job. I also wanted to ask her who she thought called her in. Without hesitation, she said it had to be Alex, who was one of our drivers. "Why do you think it was Alex?" I asked. "He's the one that dropped me off at the restaurant that day. He might have seen my friend walk in right after me and called the police on us," she said. I knew the part about him dropping her off was true. That's literally his job and her only free mode of transport. "Well, that sounds a bit drastic. Why would he do that even if he had seen you do anything?" I asked. She claimed it was because he was jealous. He was really into her apparently and kept trying to get her into bed, she said. What genuinely pissed me off was when she told me that he actually tried to force himself on her once and she fought him off, and that he hasn't tried or even said anything since other than be very short and curt with her. My immediate response was, "Why on earth would you not tell me or one of your managers right away?" She looked down, fidgeting with her hands. "I dealt with it my way, and it stopped. Plus, I didn't want anybody to get fired on my account, and I didn't want any interaction with the authorities, so I decided not to make a big deal out of it in the first place." She also declined to press formal charges against him, which I advised her to do. Her declining infuriated me even more. This guy was going to get off scot-free. Now, clearly I was about to fire Alex, but in my mind, that wasn't enough. For someone to attempt to assault a person basically and not get in trouble for it, not okay with me, but it seemed like it was something I had to live with. Obviously, my next conversation of the day was with Alex. My intent was to confront him with the accusations. I called him into my office. I didn't really know where to start, so I went with, "Obviously, you've heard about what happened to Maria this weekend." He stepped in it right away. "Heard about it," came the unexpectedly proud response from a proud as hell and positively beaming Alex. "I called it in." And this is where it started to get super satisfying. You see, for a couple of years since I met Alex, every now and then he would pull out and show us all pictures of his wife, who was back home living with his mother. She was younger than him and quite beautiful, but sadly unable to have children, which is apparently why she settled with an older fart like him. He was so proud of how pretty she was. He was also a devout religious man, or so he claimed. So I asked, "And why call the police?" He came back with, "After I dropped her off, I waited to see who she was meeting because she's a troublemaker woman. When I saw the man walk in after her, I called police because I know him, and he is married, and this is against the laws of God and man." I'm smiling now. I knew I got him. Why do that instead of calling your direct manager or even me and before even seeing for yourself what they were doing exactly? Why make it my problem and the company's problem what she does in her own time? Silence. Head down, counting his shoes. "Alex, I know why. I know what you did. Maria just told me." I'm disgusted by you and sorry that we hired you." He had the audacity to mumble, "I only tried once, sir. I almost slapped him." Anyway, I fired him, handed him a one-way ticket home, which was in 4 hours, and told him to get the hell out. This is where I get my not-so-petty revenge. I had his house phone number saved somewhere from when we hired him. It was on his CV. I knew that because I called him there to interview him before we first hired him. I waited until his flight took off and dialed the number. I assumed either his mother or wife would answer the call, but I was wishing for the latter. I got my wish. "Hello, Mrs. Alex. I'm your husband's employer. Well, his former employer anyway. Just so you know, I fired him a few hours ago, and he's on a flight home as we speak. His flight number is XXX. He will be arriving at XXX time. Just so you are aware, I was forced to fire him because he attempted to assault a fellow employee half his age." "I'm sorry," I said, and promptly hung up, but not before hearing her gasping in shock. The next one is an entitled people story. I've been working at this small, family-owned grocery store for about 3 years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I actually enjoy the work. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, are great people who treat their employees well. Everything was going smoothly until Karen walked into our lives. She started shopping at our store about 6 months ago and has been a nightmare ever since. Always complaining about prices, demanding to speak to the manager over the tiniest things, and just generally making everyone's life miserable. Last week, things came to a head. I was working the register when Karen came up with her cart full of groceries. As I started scanning her items, she immediately began nitpicking. That can of beans rang up for $1.29. The sign said $1.19. She snapped. I politely explained, "I'm sorry about that, ma'am. Sometimes the sale signs don't get taken down right away. I'll adjust the price for you." But Karen wasn't satisfied. "This is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to point out every single pricing error. Don't you people know how to do your jobs?" I took a deep breath and kept my cool. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I'll double-check all the prices for you." As I carefully went through her items, Karen tapped her foot impatiently and huffed loudly. When I finished, she glared at me. "I can't believe how incompetent you are. I want to speak to the owner right now." I explained that the owners weren't in at the moment, but I'd be happy to get the manager on duty. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I know for a fact that Sarah Johnson is here today." I was confused. Sarah Johnson? That wasn't the name of either of the owners. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. The owners are John and Mary Johnson. There's no Sarah Johnson that I know of." Karen's face turned red with anger. "How dare you! I've known Sarah for years. She told me herself she'd be working today. Get her out here right now or you'll be sorry." At this point, other customers were starting to stare. I tried to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let me get the manager to sort this out." But Karen wasn't having it. She puffed up her chest and declared loudly, "I don't need your manager. I'm personal friends with the owner, and I'm telling you right now, you're fired. Pack up your things and get out." I was stunned. Who did this woman think she was? "Ma'am, you don't have the authority to fire me. Only the owners can do that." Karen smirked smugly. "We'll see about that. Sarah Johnson, get out here right now." To my shock, a woman emerged from the back office. But it wasn't Mrs. Johnson, it was Sarah, one of our newer cashiers who had only been working there a few months. Karen pointed at her triumphantly. "There! I told you Sarah Johnson was here. Now fire this idiot immediately." Sarah looked completely bewildered. I'm sorry, but I'm just a cashier. I can't fire anyone." Karen's face fell. But you told me you were the owner. We met at that party last month, remember?" Sarah shook her head. "I think you must have misunderstood. I said I worked for the owners, not that I was an owner. My last name isn't even Johnson." Just then, the real Mrs. Johnson walked in the door, returning from lunch. She took in the scene with confusion. "What's going on here?" she asked. Karen turned beet red and started stammering. I quickly filled Mrs. Johnson in on what had happened. As I explained, her expression changed from confusion to anger. She turned to Karen. "Let me get this straight. You lied about knowing me, tried to get my employee fired, and have been harassing my staff? I think it's time for you to leave. You're no longer welcome in this store." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But, you can't do that. I'm a paying customer." Mrs. Johnson stood firm. "I absolutely can. This is private property and I have the right to refuse service to anyone. Please leave now before I call the police for trespassing." Karen looked around wildly, realizing she had no more cards to play. With a frustrated shriek, she stormed out of the store, leaving her cart full of groceries behind. Mrs. Johnson turned to me with a kind smile. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. Are you okay?" I nodded, still a bit shaken. "I'm fine, thanks. I just can't believe she tried to get me fired." Mrs. Johnson patted my shoulder. Well, you handled it beautifully. In fact, I think you deserve a raise for putting up with that nonsense. My eyes widened in surprise. Really? Thank you so much. As word spread about what happened, our regular customers were outraged on my behalf. Many of them had their own Karen stories to share. The next few weeks, business actually increased as people came in specifically to show their support. We never saw Karen again after that day. But about a month later, I was working the register when a sheepish-looking man approached me. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I believe my wife caused some trouble here a while back. I wanted to come and apologize on her behalf. She's been going through some things, but that's no excuse for how she behaved." I was touched by his gesture. "Thank you, I appreciate that. I hope she's doing better now." He nodded. "She is. This was a wake-up call for her to get some help. She's in therapy now and working on her issues." As he left, I felt a sense of closure. Karen had tried to get me fired, but instead she ended up getting herself banned and gaining some much-needed perspective, and I got a raise out of the deal. Sometimes karma really does work in mysterious ways. The next one is a petty revenge story. My husband and I bought a franchise. At the time, I was working at another job while my husband was taking over the business and no one in the network had met me yet. On the day before the takeover, my husband, the previous owner, and the company's area manager were doing a final check and stock take in the store during business hours. I was meeting them in store after work to go over the finals with them and meet everyone, as I would eventually be heavily involved in the business, payroll, accounting, and HR side of things. I should add something important. Taking over the business meant that we could choose to keep the current staff on, or we could choose not to and hire new people without any legal repercussion. As of the moment I walked up to the store for the first time, all of the current staff had been told by the previous owner that their jobs were safe. We didn't want to fire everyone who knew the job to replace them with unskilled people. That's just silly. All they had to do was meet us and obviously make a good impression. I walked up to the front counter, it is a retail food business, and smiled and greeted the sales team member Karen. I later found out Karen had been working in this particular store for about 6 years and had been with the brand for approx 9 years. I was met with a glare and a sour look, and would you believe it, no greeting, not even a basic hello. Now Karen didn't know who I was, and for all she knew, I was a regular customer coming to buy product. I was immediately annoyed at this, but still with a smile on my face, I introduced myself. Nothing. She continued to glare, didn't introduce herself or even attempt to crack a smile. She still didn't say hello. I was now extremely annoyed at how rude Karen was, and working in customer service for years myself and having taught it as a profession, and being, a decent human, I was shocked that someone with her demeanor still even had a job. I then quite abruptly told her to let me in because I was one of the new owners and was expected to be at the meeting in the store. With a huff, she opened the door and let me through. She still couldn't even crack a smile or be remotely polite to me, which pissed me off even more because she was expecting to be kept on with us. After a few minutes talking to my husband, the area manager and previous owner, I told them that that level of service won't be accepted in this store and that we would definitely not be keeping her on. My husband agreed 100% and it was decided. On my way out and as the store was closing, I said goodbye to good old Karen and casually dropped in, "It was lovely to meet you today, Karen. However, we won't be keeping you on at this store, so please ensure you take all of your belongings when you leave. Have a great night." Karen was visibly shocked, and the joy of watching her face drop, realizing she no longer had a job, was blissful. My husband stayed until after closing to make sure Karen didn't do or take anything she shouldn't, and I skipped merrily back to my car. Enjoy unemployment? Karen, the next one is a malicious compliance story. I worked as a care staff for a private company of 250-ish employees that deals with special needs individuals, mental disabilities, and often physical ones. We have day-hab facilities and group homes. In a prior job, I did the same for the state, but was moved to an IT role after a while until the stupid from upper management became too great. Whole other story. Before any of that, I was an EMT, and before that, I was in the Army and know how to cover my own ass. Backstory complete. My boss sent out an email to all staff and had an in-person company meeting because I put on a form the state inspectors look at that said, "Client returned from day trip sunburned, disoriented, and dehydrated. Staff with the client reported they passed out. Apparent heat exhaustion, reported to RN and state authority for possible neglect." Apparently, the RN never looked at the report before the state auditors came in a week later, although she did look at the client and agreed with me about the heat exhaustion the next day when she was back in the office from a day off. Fast forward 9 days, we have an emergency company meeting. Boss hands out a paper specifically telling every staff they are not to do anything outside the scope of their job description, and they are not doctors while staring at me the whole time. She calls me out specifically during the meeting by name. Alright, fine. I stopped doing anything but the exact wording of my original hiring duties. 2 months pass. One day I get a call about a problem with the computers at the main office in San Antonio. My job is over an hour away. I had traditionally done all the IT troubleshooting as I was one for the first hires of the company, and I had a background for it. Boss calls me on my day off and asks me to drive to the main office and fix their computer system. I said to her, I cannot do anything outside of my listed duties per your order. Then I hang up and turn the phone off until dinner. After I turn the phone back on, I get a call within 10 minutes from the company owner. He, who had been nothing but nice to me up until now, just bluntly asks, when I felt like doing my job and getting things working, but especially payroll, don't I want to get paid tomorrow? Get your ass in gear, son. That may indeed have been the wrong way to start the conversation with someone who wasn't being paid extra for their IT problems. I referred him to the email and in-person letter boss had put out. Then I pointed out how company policy had a no firearms rule, but he specifically always carried a 1911 to all company meetings and events on his right hip, calling it out by model as a Kimber 4. I then politely advised him to find a way to deal with his own problems, as the computers being bricked wasn't one of mine, but paying employees such as me was one of his, per state and federal law, and hung up. Turned my phone off again until I was at work 2 days later. In that time, apparently 3 staff had quit from failing to be paid. 18 more were threatening to, and the owner had driven over to have a chat with boss and myself. They laid out that as a senior care staff, my job role had expanded over the years I was there, 5 at that point, and I countered that the pay hadn't. At all since I had been hired. My doing IT work was a charity for me, not a job requirement, and I appreciated none of the disrespect I'd gotten lately from either of them. I also pointed out that I knew full well that a contract IT company would cost them at least hundreds, if not thousands, for a consult, and at least $200 an hour, and if I deigned to fix their problem, it would take about 3 hours. Owner offered me a 50-cent raise and 3 hours overtime. I countered with a public apology in front of all staff from boss, a $3 HR raise, and an exemption from the no-carry firearm policy he was being hypocritical about. They said no, so I said, I'll be in the back with the clients doing my job duties, and let me know when they contacted an IT company and changed their minds. Keep in mind that all the computer systems were effectively bricked at this point, so the nurses can't do any charting, no one can bill time for casework, the state paperwork, while largely paper, can't be sent. It took them 4 days, who knows how many calls to computer specialists for quotes, and another 8 quitting employees to agree to my conditions after 4 tries to get me to let go of the concealed carry one. That was their sticking point. I don't carry a gun at work and never have, even though in my state it's totally legal, but it bugged me the absolute hypocrisy of the owner, so I would have given up the raise before that. In the end, it turns out that the owner's wife deleted something she shouldn't have had access to, and it took all of 8 minutes to restore them from backups I personally had on an old hard drive I wasn't using that the company said were an unnecessary cost. The next one is an entitled people story, so this happened a while back when I was still a minor on a short flight. At the time 16F was seated from row of the plane in the window seat. I was flying alone to meet my dad, who had already been gone for a while. My dad had kindly booked the seat in the middle seat as blocked so I didn't have to sit next to another person. This man sits in the aisle seat across the row from me, and I politely greet him. I'm not American, and it's rather normal here to make polite and friendly conversation with the people you're sitting next to on flights. So cue some harmless small talk about our destination and what we are there for, etc. This is when things start to get slightly weird. We're now fully boarded and this grown man looks at me and says, "Well, I'm so glad nobody came and sat between us," in a weird tone that made me uncomfortable. I quietly place my laptop under my seat and awkwardly point out that my dad had blocked the seat so that I would not have to sit next to strangers as I am a minor. He attempts to move to the middle seat and I politely tell him not to and that I would prefer my space. Once we've taken off, I resume working on an essay for school and he continues trying to talk to me, getting more and more frustrated as I reply blandly and without much interest. Eventually, he asks me if he can have my phone number. I decline, remind him that I am a minor and he is a good 10 years older than me. He starts to ask for my social medias, trying to look over at my phone for them. He's getting angry and asking me what my big deal is. I should just give them to him. I'm attractive, and it's a compliment. I look at him and bluntly state that him trying to have romantic relationships with a minor is illegal, and he proceeds to say no, it's not, and he can take care of me, and I should just give him one of my social medias so he can date me, etc. I again tell him no, and he's very frustrated in his seat once again, trying to move to the middle one, but I again remind him not to. My final straw is him handing me his phone and telling me to type the name of my school into it so he can find me. Firmly decline again. I've been firm for a good 15/20 minutes of this flight, and he still believes he is entitled to knowing my details, and I am being rude. I get up and walk to two flight attendants rolling a cart down the aisle, shaking, and tell them what's going on. The male flight attendant goes over and speaks to a captain sitting in the jump seat before he goes and kneels next to the man in the aisle and speaks to him. Though majorly disgruntled, the man stops talking to me, but not without dirty looks. Last bit of my flight I spend with my headphones in securely and writing an essay. The kicker? This man had been bragging about the fact that he was an engineer who was returning from winning engineering team of the year. And his boss? Sitting 2 seats away watching this entire encounter. What in the world? Anyway, men are not entitled to women and their details, especially not minors. Sadly, men in this country tend to treat women with great disrespect and very little care for their autonomy and consent. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.